Hey everyone, it's Matthew here at Midland Pictures. Today we're going to cover how I color grade my videos, so check it out. Save it for conversation. Now you have to understand that a lot of the difficult work in color grading or color correcting your videos actually takes place when you're filming. Your camera settings, your white balance, your exposure, those things are going to play a big role in how color correction and color grading go when you're actually sitting down to finalize your video. I shoot all of my material that's in my studio, usually on my C300 Mark II. I'm shooting in 4K DCI with controlled lighting from all of the aperture lights I've shown you on some of my previous lighting setup videos. If you're not familiar with those, I'll put a link up above and down in the description so you can check them out. So things like white balance and exposure are incredibly important in making sure that when you sit down to color correct and color grade your videos, you're not doing a lot of major repair work. Even a setting like ISO, you should understand what your camera's native ISO is so that when you set the ISO, especially under a controlled lighting environment, you're not getting a lot of noise in your shadows. Other things that you have to consider is if you're shooting in a log profile. If you're shooting in a log profile, you need to understand what IRE value is best for skin tones in that log profile, and you have to understand what that log profile does as far as exposure goes. In some log profiles, in order to keep the blacks as noiseless as possible, you have to not only be shooting at the native ISO, but sometimes you have to overexpose your image by a stop or two in order to keep that noise level down. Because the footage is in a log profile, overexposing by a stop or two isn't going to be damaging to your skin tones and the color of your skin tones, because the footage has that latitude to be able to do that. Other things that factor in is your footage 8-bit? Is it 10-bit? Is it 12-bit? Is it RAW? What format is it recording in? The C300 records in an MXF format, while my EOS R records in an MP4 that's only 8-bit. On my C300, I get 10-bit at 4K, but I could actually do a 12-bit 444 color space if I shoot in 2K. This might make some of you kind of feel like screaming because it's so complicated and difficult to understand. I'm not even a cinematographer. I don't do any work as a cinematographer. I'm not out there billing myself as a cinematographer. A lot of this is information that I've gleaned through film school. It's information that I've gleaned just by being on set here in Omaha and working in the film business for 10 years. It's stuff that I've gleaned from Cody Jones, who's usually working as my cinematographer and or my first AC, and he's often doing the color work on my videos that are from paid clients. I don't do any of the color grading for stuff that's for my clients, that's paid work. I really only do it with my YouTube channel, and I wouldn't even consider that true color correction or color grading. I'm using Final Cut Pro, and as great as the tools are in Final Cut Pro, they pale in comparison to DaVinci Resolve, and there's even more advanced things to understand like Rec 709, Rec 2020, HDR, SDR, color space transform. So there's a lot of complicated stuff that goes into this. Then you have to factor in things like your monitor. Is it under Apple's color management guidelines? If you're using a Dell monitor versus a Thunderbolt or an XDR display or your laptop screen, does the software you're using get governed by Apple's color management software? A lot of people color grade in DaVinci or in Premiere, and when they play their video back in QuickTime, they look different. Well, QuickTime is an Apple program with its color science managed by the Apple color management software. For more information on that, I'll put a link below. It's a little bit more sciencey and engineering-y than I really can explain, but this article does a good way to get you to understand why you might be seeing those differences. Even on my setup, I have a Dell display that I usually do all of my work off of, but then I have a Thunderbolt display, and if I move the image from the Dell display to the Thunderbolt display, it can look very different. So with all that being said, color grading and color correction is incredibly difficult. It's very technical. It's even very much beyond technical into what's really the engineering behind video. Stuff that I don't even begin to understand as much as a colorist who really understands the engineering behind video. But with that being said, I do have a post-production workflow for all of my videos that I try to follow and that I've tried to improve over the last 6 or so months as this channel has expanded. Coloring before that was a little bit of an afterthought. It was something I did very quickly, used a basic LUT from Canon that was built into Final Cut, made a couple minor adjustments. I didn't really have a deep understanding of how to dial in a better looking grade for all of the videos that I produce. So knowing that there was a lot of inconsistency between my videos, I wanted to partner up with Cody for him to develop a LUT that I would be able to use on both my EOS R and my C300 that would be very close to each other and would require only minor tweaks as long as I made sure that my white balance, my ISO, my exposure, everything on the camera side while I was filming was taken care of. So we're gonna jump into the edit bay here and take a look at a couple different setups that are lit and shot with my C300 here in my studio, and I'm gonna show you some of the basic tools I use in Final Cut to get the finished look for each video. So we're gonna start with the video that I shot a few months ago where I was seated on the couch in the studio with a couple practicals behind me, some blue light in the background for some color contrast, and using my aperture lights as a key light, a fill light, and an edge light. So we're going to take a small portion of this and drop it down into the timeline. And you can see in my window here, this was shot at 4K, but I have a 2:1 aspect ratio on my edit because I like using a 2:1 aspect ratio for the videos that I upload, so that they more fill the screen when people are watching on their iPhones. Just to really quick take a look at those settings, it's 4096 by 2048. I shoot everything in 24 frames per second, a hard 24 frames per second in a Rec 709 color space. So if we take a look at this clip, you can see in Final Cut that I have a color grading workspace set up for making this tutorial video. Normally these layouts would be a little bit different because I'm working in Final Cut across 2 monitors. So I mentioned before that I shoot everything in log profile. On my C300 Mark II, I shoot in Canon Log 3, and that makes all the footage come in pretty flat. But Final Cut does something where it automatically applies a LUT that matches with the camera LUT profile that you shot in. So if you come over here to your inspector and go to the information tab, you can see here under camera LUT that this already has a LUT applied, which is cool because if you're just going to be editing and you're not going to be doing your color grading, it's nice to just have that basic LUT. You get a pretty decent looking image compared to with it not being there. You can see how flat and not contrasty, and it's not really something that you really want to edit with. This isn't, it's not easy to look at this. You certainly don't want to send a rough edit to a client or somebody else to review your video when it has no LUT applied to it. What I usually do when I film a video is I will film maybe 5 or 10 seconds of just sort of like a test to make sure that my lighting looks good, that my exposure is correct, that everything is lining up in Final Cut before I actually roll cameras on the entire video, which can sometimes, with how rambly I am, be anywhere from 30 minutes to sometimes an hour. So I want to make sure everything is just right. So what I'll do is I'll actually do like a first pass grade at this just to make sure, especially that exposure is correct. So I'll turn this off, and then I will look up custom LUT in the effects here. This is a built-in Final Cut effect that allows you to add a custom LUT. What I'll do is I'll apply the custom LUT that I have that Cody created for me for the C300. So here we've got the custom LUT, and I have this CJ, which stands for Cody Jones, C-Log C300. And I'll apply that. You can immediately see it's incredibly dark, very contrasty. How is this even close to what you're thinking of using? Well, I want to double check the exposure on my face. So the next thing that I'm going to do is pull up a draw mask, and then I'm going to move the mask above the LUT. And then I have my pen tool here so I can draw my mask, and I'll go around the skin portion of my face because I want to isolate my skin tone. And we can see here that I'm a little bit underexposed. When you're shooting in Canon Log 3 and you're using the waveform, you want your skin tone or a gray card to register at about 38 IRE, so right below the 40 line. If you're not familiar with shooting with a waveform, there are, I'm sure, several videos online on YouTube that you can look at to understand that. And this right here, this Luma, is the waveform that I use on my camera. It doesn't look the same, but the camera has the same basic information. It's showing your 0 as your darkest blacks, and then up to 100, which is the broadcast safe line for Rec. 709. I have a marker here for 68 because once you've actually shot the Canon log and you apply a LUT, you want your skin tones to be at about 68 IRE. You can see here that I'm well under that. So the next thing that I'll do to see if I can still work with the footage is I will add some color wheels. And then I have to go back here and make sure that the color wheels are above the custom LUT effect. Because if you do the color wheels below the custom LUT effect, you lose the dynamic range of shooting in Canon log. This to me is a little bit of a flaw in Final Cut, that you can't maybe like pin the custom LUT effect to the bottom or put it almost in like a separate like effects container where it's always at the bottom. Because anytime I add another effect, I'm always having to go back to the main effects panel, drag that color correction up above the custom LUT so that the dynamic range of the footage is preserved. So I'm going to go into the color wheels, and again, like you can see on the sort of the bright side of my face, we've got the highlights here. I'm going to drag this up a little bit and try to get it to touch 68 IRE, and then take a look and see what that looks like. And you can see with how much I had to raise the highlights, I didn't do a very good job of checking my exposure on this shoot. So let's go ahead and go back and take the mask off. And yeah, it's certainly better. This is definitely an improvement. I'm going to put the mask back on, and now I'm going to check my skin tones on the Vectorscope. So I'll switch this over to Vectorscope. And on the Vectorscope, they have this line here, which is for skin tones. This line of color, you want that on this line here on your Vectorscope. And it's just skewed a little bit to the left there. So I'm going to go into color wheels and see about adjusting the midtones, midtones being where your skin tones are, and see if I can get that just to bump over a little bit. And that's a little bit more centered. And it seems like I hardly did anything, but it really helps get that skin tone right on the line there. So we can see with the Luma waveform that our exposure is good on my skin tones, and with the Vectorscope that my skin tones are on that line. So I can take the mask off and just kind of get an overall look. So honestly, that really does a good job of bringing things where I want them. This LUT is designed to have a bit of a teal and orange look so that things like these practicals have a nice warm glow. You can see that here. And that the background and the shadows are more of a teal color to help create color contrast and really make my skin tones and the overall look of the image be as cinematic as possible. So if I was to sit down and have rolled about 10 seconds as I was testing the footage, I would actually go back to my set and adjust the exposure levels so that my skin tones weren't so underexposed, and then film from there knowing I had more proper exposure on my skin tones. So let's just do this again with another clip, and let's go to footage, and then we're gonna do a setup where I have at my desk. And I'm gonna switch this to Vectorscope, get that ready. And then I'm gonna use the draw mask and the custom LUT. And add that. We'll put the custom LUT keep the custom LUT at the bottom. And then if you ever have something like this happen where you're using custom LUT and then you apply your LUT and it looks like this really shows that you have two LUTs applied. So again, we have to go back to the info tab, and Final Cut automatically applied the Canon Log 3 default LUT. So we want to tell it to have none. And then now you can see that we've got the custom LUT that I had. Now this doesn't look that great. It's very kind of green and whatever, but you'll see just like we did before, once we dial in with the color wheels, we're going to be a lot closer to what we want it to be. So I'm going to add the color wheels, and again I have to pop back out and then make sure the color wheels are above, because if I leave them down here and try to adjust exposure, I'll show you in a second after I draw my mask, it's not going to look right. All right, so if we adjust these color wheels, we can see where exposure is pretty good. We're just a touch below 68 IRE. But if I adjust these, the LUT on, it doesn't quite hold up as well. And if we do it outside, you can see, even though it's overexposing, the way the brighter spots on my skin, it just holds together well. It doesn't get as pulled apart, and there's more information retained when you apply your color correction on top of your LUT versus below it. Again, I am not a colorist and I'm not a video engineer, so I can't really get in depth about the science behind this. I just know that it's a rule that you follow when color grading, especially in Final Cut. But you can see we've got my highlight just touching 68 IRE, and that to me looks pretty darn good. And then on our Vectorscope, I'm a little bit on the more yellow and green side, so I'm gonna see if I can get this a little bit more on the line. And that ought to do it. And then we'll pop back over, turn our mask off. And man, that just looks so much better with just those minor adjustments. So we'll go ahead and pop this off. You can see how green it sort of looks. And my skin, just with even it being just a little bit under 68 IRE, it just doesn't quite look as vibrant and alive as it does with this small adjustment. You can see here our warm tones from the practical are really nice. My skin, especially on the darker side, has a little bit of redness to it, which it just naturally does. But then our shadows back here are more in the blues, so we really get that nice teal and orange cinematic color contrast look that we have all grown to really, that's really pleasing to the eye. So I'm going to do one last clip here, and this is the test clip that I shot for this video. So I sat down here, I rolled for about 10 seconds just to make sure I could check in Final Cut how everything looked. I already did all the work to check this, and I actually adjusted my exposure because I was a little underexposed. But let's go ahead and take a look at this as well. So we're going to add a custom LUT, make sure that applied, and then we're going to add a mask. I'm going to put the mask above. The mask above or below doesn't really matter. It's just a mask. It's not really affecting the color information of the clip. But I'm going to go ahead and draw my mask around my skin tone to isolate that. We'll get my neck in here a little bit. Now we don't have a LUT applied, so we need to go in and add that custom LUT. We'll go ahead and drop on the C300 LUT. You can see here we're underexposed, which is why I made the exposure adjustment with my lights so I could bring the levels up. On my monitor that I'm looking at above the C300, it looks like a little too bright on the monitor. It looks like I'm overexposed, but on the waveform, it is right below 40 IRE at about 38 IRE, which is where we want to be. So we'll go ahead and add a color wheel here, and I'm going to show you again what it looks like if you forget to put the color wheel above the custom LUT. So let's go in, especially because we're raising the highlights quite a bit here to get them up to 68 IRE. Actually doesn't look terrible with this not in the correct place. But let's drag it up above the LUT, and you can see now it's actually overexposed. So when the color wheels was below the custom LUT and I raised the highlights and hit my exposure line at 68 IRE, everything looked okay for the most part. But then when I put the color wheels above the custom LUT, it actually extended that highlight to be overexposed. So we want to make sure that we have this, again, above the custom LUT, get it all dialed in, make sure that our skin tones are right where we want them to be. And I'll tell you what, this Vectorscope with my skin tones on it looks right on the money. Can't really see any adjustments that I would do to fix that. So let's go ahead and pull the mask off and see what our image looks like. And I think this looks really good. There's a little bit of maybe a little bit more teal in this shot because there aren't a lot of daylight practicals in the image. I actually have my shop light turned off, which is at 4000K, so it's a little bit warmer because I'm shooting at 5600K, which is sort of the low end of daylight. So once we do the final video, the video you're watching right now, you'll see that warm orangish shop light in the background. And here, instead of letting the practical that I have over here on my desk put some warm fill on this, I really wanted to fill my side of my face in quite a bit more. So I put one of my Aperture 120Ds, which is why this light is so bright, to fill this side of my face. So this looks, you know, pretty good. I'm going to double check my RGB overlay here. And let's see, waveform. And then we've got the RGB. The reds look a little intense in the shadow. Let me just try a few things here. See if we can tweak this a little bit. That's a little too much. Some of this is by eye and some of it is a little bit more based on the actual science of the waveform here. You can see with the RGB overlay, you can really see the spread of the reds, greens, and blues. And because this is a stylized LUT, it's a grade, not a correction. I want there to be some differentiation here, so it's not like this perfectly balanced color overlay. I want my skin tones where I need them. And this looks pretty good. And you know, you can see from shot to shot, this looks like a pretty green to me, but this one does too. But again, like these environments are completely different. Here we're shooting with a daylight key light. We have all these warm practicals. We've got this really dramatic blue light in the background. We've got this warm light coming from a light above this practical. And that's going to just create an overall seriously different look. This one looks a little bit faded, so maybe I'll bring the midtones down a little bit. And then that kind of matches up contrast-wise with this one. And then this one's pretty good. Yeah, I don't want to really bring the midtones down a touch. And maybe just bring a little bit of the teal out of the shadows because it's just a little too green overall. Now again, if you're a colorist, someone that really understands how all this works, the in-depth science, all of that stuff, and the art form of it, understanding how to take something that is scientifically a balanced and correct image and then applying a stylistic grade to it, I am not doing that with these videos myself. Cody gave me a LUT. He put together a LUT based on my feedback. We had worked on a commercial together for Bank of America, and I really loved the LUT that the DP had made for that commercial, and it was made for an Arri Alexa Mini. So Cody used DaVinci Resolve to sort of translate that LUT to a Canon camera, the C300 Mark II, and for the most part it worked. You know, again, a teal and orange LUT. It was the custom LUT made by the DP. And you know, I really wanted to adopt that look for my channel, and I think we've succeeded. Where it gets messed up is when I start tweaking stuff. You can see, I'm sure if Cody, you're watching this, or a colorist is looking at the difference between these images and is seeing some serious inconsistencies. I understand that, and I understand for you it might be frustrating, but again, I am not a true colorist, so I don't know how to really pilot these color correction tools to get these things to be dialed in perfectly. If we had this clip in Cody's studio, he would be doing things to really make sure that once that LUT is applied, the image is being dialed in for skin tones, for the look in comparison to the other videos I've made, especially if Cody was the one who was doing the color work on all of those videos, which I'd love for him to be able to do, but that's not something I can expect of him, and this channel doesn't generate the kind of revenue to have a colorist tackle the color grade on every single video. Plus that process really slows down post-production. You have to get it from Final Cut over to DaVinci and then from DaVinci back again, and that takes a lot of time. So again, there's key differences between these setups. In this setup, everything is daylight. All of my sources are daylight. I don't even have a hair light on, which I probably should. I wonder if I turn it on. And you can see just that little bit of orangish light on the top of my head really can change the overall feeling of the image. So for this, which I have in Final Cut, there's no hair light above my head. Everything is just sort of general soft daylight, and there aren't, again, a lot of practicals that create color contrast. Whereas with this one, there's daylight on my face, but then a ton of tungsten practicals in the background, which makes your eye see things a little bit differently for this image, even though this image is essentially all of the same settings as this image. And then same thing for this. You can see a lot more reds, orange, these warm tones, and it just looks a lot different than this. And that's okay. We can't make everything. I am not capable of making everything match perfectly. I'm using a very basic understanding of color grading and color correction to get my videos to look the way that they do. And I just wanted to share with you all the very simple tools I use in Final Cut to do what I do. Because of my simplistic understanding of correction and grading, I am not able to have my videos look as refined and consistent as some of the other YouTubers out there that I follow. YouTubers like Becky and Chris, Tyler Stallman, Peter McKinnon, and Gerald Undone. They do such a great job of having a consistent look and color for every video, whether it's B-roll, whether it's lit, not lit, and hats off to them. They are incredible at what they do. They come from the world of photography and photography editing, so they have a real command and understanding of color, and I simply am not there. So my channel, maybe it suffers a little bit in comparison to people like Tyler Stallman, Becky and Chris, Peter McKinnon, but for me, this works with the different sets that I have here in the studio, and Final Cut has some simple and effective tools to be able to get the look that I want. A lot of you have been asking for color grading videos, color correction videos. I hope this isn't a disappointment, and if there's anything specifically that you're looking to understand more about color, maybe drop me a line down in the comments and I can connect you with some resources that might help you, or I can work on a video with Cody to try to show some of his world so that you get a better understanding of how to apply some of these principles to your videos. Again, the big conclusion and summary is that color correction and grading is a lot more than just sitting down at your computer with your footage and applying LUTs or basic effects, effects that you purchase from other creators or other plugin makers, and calling it good. There is a ton of work that you have to do on the camera side of things, and with the lights. You can see just what kind of impact one little tiny hair light does to the overall look of this scene. So it's important to understand color temperature, ISO, exposure, understanding your waveform, and how to use a gray card to dial in your skin exposure and make sure that you're not having color issues because you're under or overexposed. Understanding LUTs and the different settings with your camera, color spaces, Rec 709, Rec 2020, SDR versus HDR, all of that stuff. And then taking all of that and applying it to how you film your videos so that when you sit down to do your work, you're doing as little color correction as possible. You're not fixing a botched white balance. You're not dealing with noise reduction because there's too much noise in the shadows. Everything is for the most part in good shape. It just requires some small tweaks, and then you can do the fun part, which is applying a more artistic grade to your footage, whether it's a fade, more contrast, blacker blacks, whatever it is that you want for your look, teal and orange. We've got ours dialed in here with Cody's custom LUTs. This is what it looks like with the C300. I'll try to do a follow-up video at some point where I sit down with B-roll from my EOS R and show the process that I go through with my B-roll, because it can be a little bit more difficult to grade if there isn't skin tones in the shot, or sometimes something white, especially as I'm running and gunning B-roll between indoors with tungsten lights, 4000K lights, sunlight, a cloudy day. All of those things affect how easy or difficult it is to color grade your footage in post-production. Please drop me a comment if you have any resources that you think might help me with my workflow. And again, the best thing that you can do to support the channel is to click the like button below. If you're a frequent watcher and you're not subscribed, click the subscribe button below and click the bell so you get notifications every time you upload a video. Thanks everyone for joining me. I hope this has been helpful. Until the next one, I will see you all soon.
Save it for conversation.